Jackson Vaughan had lived most of his life as a soldier, but that was before Earth fell. Now he wandered the edges of the universe, far from the home he once knew. On a remote planet called Sciara, he had built a life of solitude. The planet was rough, covered in rugged terrain, thick jungles, and towering mountains. The wildlife here was as dangerous as it was beautiful, and Jackson had learned the hard way that it was best to keep to the shadows and mind his own business. After the fall of Earth, everything changed for Jackson. He no longer had the purpose of a soldier fighting in a war. Now, he just needed to survive, one day at a time. That was his life now. No friends, no attachments, just a quiet existence in a makeshift home at the edge of the wilderness. It was on one of his long scouting trips when he first saw her. The storm was thick, the kind that seemed to pull the very breath from the air. Jackson had just set up camp when he heard the noise, faint at first but growing louder, a cry or something like it. Without thinking, he grabbed his rifle and went toward the sound. What he found wasn't what he expected. There, lying in a clearing, was a woman or something like one. She was covered in dirt and blood, her breathing shallow and ragged. Her body, slender and graceful, bore the marks of a fierce warrior. Her skin, a rich tawny brown, was marred with cuts and bruises, and her black hair, matted with sweat and dirt, was matted across her face. Her clothes were in tatters, barely holding together, and Jackson could tell by the sharpness of her features and the way her body was built that she wasn't human. She was a feline warrior, a species Jackson had heard about in the old records. Known for their combat skills and ferocity in battle, the feline warriors were a proud people. But this one was different. She was barely conscious, her breath coming in weak gasps. Jackson didn't know why, but something inside him moved. Despite the risks, he couldn't leave her there. She was too far from help, and the storm was getting worse. The wild animals that roamed the jungle would soon come for her if he didn't act. He knelt beside her, checking her wounds quickly. Her side was torn open, blood soaking through her torn shirt. Her face was pale, her eyes unfocused. With a deep breath, Jackson made a decision. He picked her up gently, his strong arms cradling her carefully as he made his way back to his shelter. It wasn't far. He had a small, makeshift cabin built into the side of a cliff, a place he had found peace. He used what little medical supplies he had left to tend to her wounds, making sure to clean and stitch them as best as he could. Her skin felt warm under his hands, her body alive with the heat of fever. Jackson didn't know if she would survive the night, but he wasn't about to let her die alone in the storm. Hours passed. Jackson stayed beside her, watching as she slowly and painfully began to regain consciousness. Her eyes fluttered open, but there was no recognition in them, only confusion. She groaned softly, her voice weak. "Where am I?" she whispered, her tone harsh but laced with exhaustion. Jackson stayed silent for a moment, unsure of how to respond. "You're safe," he said finally, his voice rough from the dust of the jungle. "I found you in the storm. You were in bad shape." The feline warrior blinked at him, her expression turning into a mixture of confusion and distrust. "You're human," she rasped, her voice filled with suspicion. "Yeah," Jackson replied, "I'm human." She didn't seem to trust him, and Jackson understood why. There was no reason for a warrior like her to trust someone like him. He wasn't one of her people, and he didn't belong in her world. But she didn't have a choice now. Her body was weak, and her injuries were too severe for her to get far on her own. "You'll be fine," Jackson said, trying to reassure her. "But you need rest. You're not going anywhere in your condition." The warrior looked at him for a long time, her amber eyes narrowing with suspicion. Then, without a word, she turned her head away from him, her body tense and guarded. It was clear that she hated being in his debt, and from the way she was looking at him, Jackson could tell she didn't appreciate being rescued by someone she considered beneath her. But despite her pride, she didn't argue. She simply closed her eyes, trying to drift back to sleep. The storm outside continued to howl, but inside Jackson's shelter, there was only the quiet sound of breathing, both his and hers. As the days passed, Jackson did everything he could to help her heal. He hunted for food, boiled water, and made sure to keep her hydrated. He built a fire each night to keep the chill of the jungle at bay. Slowly, Callia's strength returned, though she refused to show any sign of weakness. She spent most of her time sitting by the fire, her back straight, her eyes always alert. But there was something in her gaze now, a flicker of gratitude buried under layers of pride. The days turned into weeks, and still Callia refused to leave. It wasn't that she couldn't, but she would not admit that she needed help. She was a warrior, one of the fiercest of her kind, and her pride ran deep. To leave Jackson would be to acknowledge that he had helped her when she couldn't help herself, and that was something she refused to do. Yet, despite her stubbornness, Jackson could see the way she began to change. She started to trust him, though she never said it outright. She would listen to his advice, help him with the hunting, and gradually become more comfortable with him. There were still moments when she would retreat into herself, her warrior's instincts taking over, but over time, the hard shell around her heart began to crack. "I didn't ask for your help," Callia finally said one evening, her voice low. She was sitting by the fire, staring at the flames as they flickered in the cool night air. Jackson looked at her, his face calm. "I know, but I did it anyway." She gave him a sharp look, but Jackson could tell that something had shifted in her. The resentment was still there, buried beneath the surface, but there was a quiet acceptance too. She hadn't asked for help, but it had been offered, and she hadn't turned it away. "I don't need a human's pity," she muttered, her voice fierce. "I can stand on my own." Jackson nodded, understanding her pride. "I didn't think you needed pity," he said quietly. "I just thought you could use a hand." There was silence between them for a long time, only the crackling of the fire breaking the quiet. Callia didn't respond, but Jackson could tell that his words had struck a chord with her. She didn't like to admit it, but she was beginning to realize that perhaps just this once she needed someone. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. As days turned into weeks, Jackson and Callia's strange partnership grew. They weren't exactly friends, but they were becoming something more. Callia, with her fierce warrior spirit, never showed weakness. She was proud in a way that Jackson respected, even though he knew it was a barrier between them. She hated owing anyone, especially someone like him. But every day she seemed to soften just a little more. Jackson watched as she slowly recovered from her wounds. At first, she had refused to speak much, and her eyes held nothing but distrust. But over time, Callia began to speak, mostly in sharp tones, but it was clear she was starting to let her guard down. She helped him with the hunting, though she never made it easy. She had an edge, a sharpness to her that made every task more difficult than it needed to be. She would challenge him to race through the woods or climb to the highest point of their shelter, just to prove she could do it better. At first, Jackson humored her, playing along with her little games. But as the days went on, he could tell that her challenges weren't about competition. They were a way for her to regain her sense of control. She needed to prove, to herself more than anyone, that she could still be the warrior she had once been. She wasn't a broken thing to be pitied. She was Callia, and no one was going to change that. Jackson knew this. And he also knew that deep down, Callia had been broken by something far greater than her physical injuries. He had seen it in her eyes when she first woke up, in the way she refused to talk about her past. He had heard the whispers of pain when she thought he wasn't listening, the moments when she would sit still for hours, her eyes fixed on nothing, lost in memories. But every time he asked about her past, she would shut down, retreating into the shell she had built around herself. Yet, despite all of this, there were moments when Jackson would catch a glimpse of something softer. When she would smile just a little when he made her laugh, although she'd quickly hide it behind a scowl. She had a way of hiding her emotions, but Jackson was learning to read her. And even though she would never admit it, she was starting to rely on him just a little. One morning, Jackson awoke to find her sitting by the fire, staring at the stars. He watched her for a moment, noting how the firelight danced across her face, casting shadows in the sharp angles of her features. She looked lost in thought, her posture tense but with an underlying sadness that Jackson couldn't ignore. He hesitated before stepping closer. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. Callia's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing as she saw him approaching. "I don't sleep much," she said, her voice cold. But the way she looked away quickly told Jackson there was more to the story than she was letting on. "You've been awake for a while," he pointed out gently. "What's on your mind?" She didn't respond at first. Instead, she stared back at the fire, watching the flames flicker. Jackson sat beside her, feeling the weight of her silence pressing against him. He didn't push her to speak, but he didn't leave either. He had learned that sometimes the silence between them spoke volumes. After a long pause, Callia sighed and finally spoke. "I was part of a tribe once," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were warriors, protectors. We fought for each other, for our people." Her eyes glazed over, and Jackson could see the pain lurking just below the sun was setting when Callia spotted them. The mercenaries, a group of ruthless men, hired by a powerful faction who had decimated her people. She had known this day would come. She had been waiting for it, training for it, preparing for it in silence. Now they were here, within reach. Jackson could feel the tension in the air as Callia's body stiffened, her muscles going taut. He had seen this before, the cold, controlled movements of a warrior ready for battle. But this time it was different. There was no fear in Callia's eyes, no hesitation, only a deep, burning need for vengeance. She didn't speak, but Jackson could tell what she was thinking. This was her moment, the one she had been waiting for since the day her tribe was destroyed. She had trained alone for so long, pushed herself to the limits, believing she could survive on her own. But now, the fight she had been preparing for had finally arrived. And she wasn't going to let it slip away. "Stay back," Callia said, her voice low and steady. She was already moving, heading toward the tree line, her steps quiet but sure. Jackson hesitated. He knew Callia didn't want his help, but this was different. These weren't wild animals or unpredictable storms. These men had killed her people, wiped out everything she had known. Jackson had watched her struggle with the weight of that loss, seen the fire in her eyes every time she talked about revenge. He couldn't let her face this alone. "I'm not staying back," Jackson said, his voice firm. "I'm with you, always." Callia didn't look back. She just kept moving, her every step purposeful. Jackson fell in behind her, keeping his distance but staying close enough to watch her. She wasn't just a warrior now, she was more than that. She was a woman who had been broken, who had suffered unimaginable loss, but she had never given up. And now she had something to fight for, something bigger than revenge. She had someone by her side. The mercenaries were camped in a clearing, just a few hundred yards away. Jackson and Callia had the high ground, hidden among the dense foliage of the jungle. The setting sun cast long shadows over the land, but the mercenaries didn't seem to notice. They were too busy making camp, too distracted by their easy victory to realize they were being watched. Callia's eyes narrowed as she studied the group. There were 5 of them, all wearing the standard dark armor of mercenaries. Their weapons were in plain sight, rifles, knives, and blades, but none of them were paying attention. They thought they were safe. They were wrong. Callia's hand went to the hilt of her sword, the cool metal comforting under her fingers. She had fought with this blade before. It had been a gift from her fallen tribe, a symbol of their strength. And now it would be the instrument of her revenge. She took a deep breath, her heart steady, and began to move. Jackson followed her, staying low to the ground, his hand on his rifle, ready for anything. The mercenaries had no idea what was coming. Callia struck first, her movements swift and graceful, a blur of motion. She dashed forward, a shadow in the night, and before the first mercenary even realized she was there, she had already knocked him to the ground. The others barely had time to react. In a matter of seconds, two of them were disarmed, lying on the ground with cuts across their faces. The other two rushed to their feet, but Kalia was already on the move again, her sword flashing through the air. Jackson fired a warning shot, sending one of the mercenaries diving for cover. He wasn't here to kill, but he wasn't about to let Kalia face this fight alone. His rifle barked again, and another mercenary dropped to the ground, clutching his shoulder. The last two turned to face Jackson, but Kalia was already on them, her body a whirlwind of strikes and blows. She moved like a dancer, each step calculated, each strike purposeful. Her enemies never stood a chance. The fight was over in minutes. The mercenaries lay sprawled on the ground, groaning in pain, their weapons scattered around them. Kalia stood tall, her breathing steady, her eyes scanning the area for any remaining threats. She didn't seem to feel the exhaustion that came with battle. She was focused, her mind clear. The rush of victory was already fading, replaced with the hollow emptiness that came with the act of vengeance. Jackson approached cautiously, lowering his rifle as he surveyed the scene. He could see the coldness in Kalia's eyes, the way she stood over her fallen enemies, looking down at them with no mercy. It was the look of a woman who had been scarred by loss, who had been forced to become something she had never wanted to be, a killer. "They're all dead," Jackson said softly, his voice filled with a quiet understanding. "It's over." Kalia didn't respond at first. She just stared at the mercenaries, her expression unreadable. Jackson could see the way her fists clenched, her body tense, as if she were ready to fight again. "You wanted revenge," Jackson said. "You've got it. But is it really what you wanted? Is it enough?" Kalia's eyes flicked to him, her gaze sharp. She didn't say anything at first, but Jackson could see the conflict in her eyes. She had wanted this. She had wanted to make them pay for what they had done. But now that it was over, the victory felt hollow. The anger that had driven her for so long was fading, leaving behind only the empty ache of what she had lost. "I don't know," Kalia said finally, her voice low. "I thought it would make me feel better. I thought it would fix everything. But it doesn't. It doesn't bring them back." Jackson stepped closer, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Nothing will bring them back, Kalia, but you're still here, and that's something." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. For a moment there was nothing but silence between them, a quiet understanding. Kalia didn't need revenge anymore. She didn't need to carry that burden alone. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Jackson smiled, a small, genuine smile. "You don't need to thank me. I'm just glad I could help." Kalia nodded, her expression softening. For the first time since he had met her, Jackson saw the faintest hint of relief in her eyes. She wasn't a broken warrior anymore. She was Kalia, a woman who had been through hell and come out the other side, stronger than before. The stars above began to shimmer in the darkening sky, and for the first time in a long while, Kalia felt like she could breathe. She wasn't alone anymore. She didn't need to fight alone. And maybe, just maybe, there was a future beyond the pain and the loss, a future where she could find peace. She turned to Jackson, her expression no longer filled with the coldness that had once defined her. "We're not done yet," she said, a small, determined smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Jackson chuckled softly. "Yeah, I know, but we'll figure it out together, together." The word hung in the air between them, and for the first time it felt like the beginning of something new, something worth fighting for. And as the stars shone brightly above, Kalia and Jackson stood side by side, ready to face whatever the future held. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were partners, and together they would write their own story.